Welcome back to my video series about setting up waypoint missions in iNav. In the previous video, we set up a basic waypoint mission and we put the flight controller into a simulator and had it fly the mission. You can see the result right here. And one of the things you see is that it didn't do such a good job of following the track that we wanted it to fly. In this video, we're going to dive in a little bit deeper into this configuration and see if we can get it to do a little bit better of a job. I'm Joshua Bardwell, and you're going to learn something today. So what can we do to tweak the way that the aircraft flies the mission? We're going to go to the Advanced Tuning tab, and that is where the options are for us to tweak the settings for that control how the flight controller flies a mission. The two sets of settings we're concerned with are the fixed wing navigation settings, and as the name implies, these apply only to fixed wings. If we were doing multi-rotor, there would be multi-rotor navigation settings, which we will take a look at perhaps in a future video, but for now, we're kind of just focused on the fixed wing side. We're just going to stick with that to keep things simple. There's also general navigation settings and waypoint navigation settings, which pertain to both multi-rotors and fixed wings. Let's take a look at some of those. General navigation settings, max altitude for navigation. So the idea here is that we're going to put a ceiling on our waypoint navigation so that it doesn't just fly up to 30,000 feet because of some misconfiguration that we've done. That is by default set to 0. I do believe that's the default, although I have tweaked some of these settings, and 0 means there is no max altitude for navigation. The other thing I wonder about is, yes, it says right here, it is the altitude above the home point. The home point is the point where you take off. So if you were to take off down in a valley and need to fly up to the top of a mountain, this could potentially be a problem, even though that whole flight might be perfectly safe. The max altitude for navigation is the maximum altitude above the takeoff point or home point, and by default it's set to 0. If you felt like you wanted to change that, you could set that to some number of meters. We're going to leave it at 0. Another setting I want you to look at is the min throttle, max throttle, and cruise throttle. So the way that a fixed wing works when it's in nav mode is that iNav doesn't care how fast it's going. All it does is it sets a certain throttle and it just stays there, and however fast the aircraft goes, that's how fast it goes. The default is that the max throttle is 1700 and the cruise throttle is 1400. And basically what that means is that when we go into nav mode, we will just set the throttle to 1400, which is 40%, and it'll just stay there. And the aircraft won't go very fast. Now I've got this set to 2000 as the cruise throttle because in the simulator, I just want it to go as fast as it could. You probably wouldn't want to do that in real life because in real life, you probably wouldn't want to run your just motor flat out. You would kill your battery. You would potentially overheat the motor. You would potentially damage the battery. You would want to find a nice cruise throttle that you were happy with the aircraft staying at for basically the entire flight. But if the cruise throttle is what throttle it's going to go to when it's in nav mode, what's the point of max throttle? Well, there are other settings. For example, when the aircraft goes into a climb, it will slightly increase the throttle to help it climb. When it goes into a descent, it will slightly decrease the throttle to keep it from picking up too much speed. So the max throttle will come into play as we go into climbs. It'll raise that throttle to a certain value. But basically, the cruise throttle is going to control how fast the aircraft goes when it's in waypoint mode. I usually find for the kind of aircraft that I'm usually flying, which are usually smaller aircraft like this one, that the cruise throttle of 1400 is slower than I want, and I usually will raise that. In the simulator, I'm just going to set it to 2000. And just the aircraft will just go full throttle the whole time because there's no battery in the simulator and it makes things go a little bit faster. Don't do that in real life. It's key when you set the cruise throttle that you not set it to too low of a value. If the aircraft ends up in a tailwind, a tailwind. If it ends up in a tailwind, then if the cruise throttle is too low, it can lose airspeed and it can stall. It doesn't have a pitot tube. It doesn't know its airspeed, and I'm not even sure it's capable of caring about the airspeed if it did have a pitot tube, which iNav does support pitot tubes, but I don't think it cares about the airspeed in nav mode, so it can't just increase the throttle to keep the airspeed up. It has no idea what the airspeed is. It only knows the ground speed, and it doesn't even care what the ground speed is. It just sets the throttle. So you need this to be high enough that the aircraft is sufficiently above its stall speed that if it ends up in a tailwind, it doesn't stall. then that's just going to depend on your aircraft, its thrust to weight ratio, its stall speed, its wing loading, and the kind of wind conditions in which it might fly. Higher will be safer, but will also potentially waste more battery. Now let's talk about some options that we have to try to get the aircraft to hit the waypoints more accurately. And it's not even fair to say accurately, because if we look at the track, it pretty much hit each of the waypoints. Like it hit this one dead on, it missed this one slightly because it couldn't make this turn sharply enough. It hit this one dead on, it hit this one dead on. It basically hit all the waypoints, but what it did was it didn't hit the track, the actual track, okay? So let's take a look at some settings that affect that. And the first thing you might want to do is change the waypoint radius. The waypoint radius is how close the aircraft has to get to a waypoint to consider itself to have hit that waypoint. If the waypoint radius was 1 meter and you passed 3 meters away from the waypoint, you would have to turn back around and come back and try and hit it. Whereas if it was set to 8 meters and you passed 2 meters away from it, you'd be like, yeah, I got it. Keep in mind that the airplane will always try and hit the waypoint as precisely as it can. It's always trying to be 0 meters from the waypoint, but due to real world stuff like wind and physics and the bank angle, it might miss it by a certain amount. So decreasing the waypoint radius doesn't make the aircraft more accurate. It just makes it more likely to have to turn around and try again. Okay? Whereas increasing the waypoint radius means that the aircraft can miss by slightly more, and it'll be like, yeah, I got it. The thing is, like, if it misses the waypoint by a little bit, like imagine that here we were coming back around and we were going to try and hit this waypoint, and instead of being within, I don't know, like 2 or 3 meters, imagine we were like 5 meters or 10 meters away. Do you want the aircraft to turn back around and try and hit it, or do you want it to just go to the next waypoint, right? I don't know. Like, I don't actually think there's an incentive to decrease this number too much, because like it's going to do its best, and if it misses, like probably you should just get on to the next one. Like probably go as close as you could get. But that's what that number does. We're going to leave that at the default of 8 meters. With multi-rotors, it's safer to reduce that number, because a multi-rotor can like, oh, I'm missing. Oh, I'll just come back around and get it. But an airplane, it's going to fly through the waypoint, and if it misses, it's going to have to come all the way around to get back to it, and it's going to be pretty messy. The actual settings that will affect the aircraft's ability to hit the waypoint, and more importantly than hitting the waypoint, to actually be on track. Do you see how here it didn't try to get back on track? It just headed toward that waypoint. And likewise here, right? It blew out this turn and it didn't try to get back on track. It just kind of went, close enough. Those settings are the waypoint tracking angle and the waypoint tracking accuracy. So the waypoint tracking accuracy is how closely the aircraft will try to be to the track in between the two waypoints. With a waypoint tracking accuracy of 0, it doesn't care if it's on track at all. Let's take that waypoint tracking accuracy and set it to, it says 2 is a good starting point, but let's try a waypoint tracking accuracy of like, let's say 5, because I think 2 may be too low. You know what, actually, let's set it to 2. If it's too low, then we'll see the bad effect and we'll be able to compensate. Let's set the waypoint tracking accuracy to 2, and now it will try to be on track between them instead of just being like, I'm headed to the next waypoint, I don't really care about the track. So depending on the aircraft, if you have that tracking accuracy set too low, then what you'll see is that it'll like be just wobbling back and forth and overcorrecting and like making constant little micro adjustments. Here we're coming to this turn. And what we should see is that it turns back sharply and gets back on track instead of blowing out the turn. Let's find out. Woof. Ground's a little tight there. Bridge is a little tight here. And, yup, it's cutting in. And... yes, fantastic. On the line. That's great. That's going great. Let's go ahead and pause this. Let's see if there's anything we can do to make it even more accurate. Again, we're going to go back to advanced tuning. And I think what we're going to do is we're going to increase the navigation bank angle. So that's the sharpest that the aircraft will bank while it's in nav mode. Now, this is a very small, lightweight aircraft. It's very agile. It can easily go past 35 degrees bank angle while still maintaining perfect control. If I had a larger, heavier craft, I might want to keep that conservative. In this case, let's just go nuts with it. Let's go to 55 degrees. We want to be, that's too much. The problem is that as it banks over, it will then have a harder time maintaining altitude, right? But I think we're going to be fine with 55 degrees. This is the kind of thing that I would definitely test on a real aircraft in the real world before I just cut loose. But in the simulator, I think we're going to be all right. Let's see what happens now when we hit this waypoint. And actually, let's watch it in the cockpit view. We'll see how steep that bank looks like. Oh, it doesn't look too bad. How's our altitude? Altitude's pretty stable. 26, 27, no big deal. Let's take a look here. Oh yeah, that is a much sharper turn, isn't it? That is a much sharper turn. And now, are we going to get back on track, no problem? Or are we going to wobble? We overshot a little bit. Now we're getting back online. Are we going to make little S turns, or are we going to get online and be good? No, we're good. We're dead on the track. That worked really well. There's another thing the aircraft is doing that you might not like, and that is it is hitting the waypoint, and it is blowing out the turn, and then turning back to the track. Now, that might be what you want if you care about the aircraft actually hitting the waypoint. But probably what you actually want is for the aircraft to kind of treat those waypoints as sort of like, you don't care if you actually hit it, I want you to kind of curve gently around it. And the setting in iNav that affects that is called waypoint turn smoothing. Hey there, it's Joshua from the future. At this point in the video, Joshua in the past tried to demonstrate something called waypoint turn smoothing. And in short, it does something, but it doesn't do what you would think it would do, and it doesn't work very well, and the whole thing kind of goes off the rails. So I'm going to summarize it here. Here's what waypoint turn smoothing does. It's supposed to do. What you would think it would do would be that if you have, if you have a waypoint that goes like this, right, it would kind of like draw a curve between them, or if you have a waypoint that goes like this, it would kind of turn off and it would kind of cut the corner. Or there's another kind of turn smoothing where it basically starts a turn, goes around and gets back on track, and basically it doesn't do that. One of the reasons it doesn't do that is that if the turn is too sharp or too shallow, waypoint turn smoothing just doesn't work at all. It just ignores it. So it has to be between 30 and 120 degrees. So you can see, like, right here is the behavior with turn smoothing off. And you can see what we've been observing is that it just goes through the waypoint and then turns back around and gets on track, right? With turn smoothing on, it does exactly the same thing. That's because that turn is too sharp, right? But if you look at this turn, which is not as sharp of a turn, you can see that it kind of does the thing. Before it gets to the turn, it turns out, and then it tracks around, and then it comes and it gets back on track. Is that better? I don't know, but it does keep it from blowing out the turn as much, and then you might want that. But then the problem is that for some turns, if the turn is like very close to 90 degrees, what ends up happening, here's one that's very close to 90 degrees, what ends up happening is that it doesn't initiate the turn until it's practically on it. And so you basically end up in the same situation where it blows the turn out and it basically doesn't do very much. Okay, well that's turn smoothing on. So there's another setting called on cut. And what that does is it makes it cut to the inside of the turn, which really seems like what you would want, but it kind of also doesn't really work that good. Like you can see here, it starts the turn and then it still kind of blows out the turn. But that actually, like, you might prefer that to like overshooting and blowing out the turn, except like It doesn't do anything on this one because it's too shallow. It doesn't do anything on this one because it's too steep. And like on this one, yeah, look at this one. Like it doesn't, it starts to cut to the inside, but because the turn is so steep, it doesn't really cut to the inside at all. And frankly, it just seems like the whole logic around turn smoothing is dumb. And like what it should do is this, where it just calculates a curve, right? Because then maybe I'd be complaining, oh, I put the waypoint here, but it cut to the inside and it cut too far to the inside. I don't know. But basically, turn smoothing, to try it. If you like what it does, like you can see the simulated track, and if you like what it does, then use it. But it's not great at actually helping you stay on track and preventing you from blowing things out. Well, there's one more setting that could be affecting things, and that is the waypoint tracking angle. The waypoint tracking angle sets the maximum allowed alignment convergence angle to the waypoint course line when the accuracy is accurate. Lower values result in smoother alignment with the course line, but will take more distance until this is achieved. Let's see if we set that approach angle to 30, what happens. So now with the 30-degree track angle, let's see what effect that has. It should get back onto track, but be less aggressive about turning to get back on track. So here's what that looks like. Oh yeah, see? Now it's approaching from a smoother angle and not turning sharply to get back on track. It's still going to try to stay on track. That's the tracking number, is how close to the track it wants to be, but the tracking angle is how sharply it will turn, and the angle that it will approach the track from. By way of comparison, let's go back and let's change it. Advanced tuning, waypoint tracking angle, we'll change that back to 60, which is the default. So the waypoint tracking accuracy is how close it wants to be to the track, how hard it will work to try to be right on top of that track. And the tracking angle is how sharply it will turn to get back to the track. If the angle is too high, it will cross the track and overshoot. If the angle is too low, it will just gradually get back on it and not try that hard. This again is something that you would have to tune with a real aircraft, because the physics of the real aircraft are going to significantly affect how it performs, but we can do it here in the sim. And here we should see a sharper turn where it gets onto track sooner. Yep. And, oh yeah, dead on. I like that way better. Okay, perfect. What did we learn today? One thing we learned is that waypoint turn smoothing doesn't have as much of an effect as I've used it in real life, but I've never actually played with it in the simulator where I could actually see how. I was just like, oh, I guess it's cutting the turn. I guess it's doing what it said it would do. But when you actually look at it in the simulator on a real flight path, you see that depending on the sharpness of that turn, it may have very little effect whatsoever. It seems like no matter what you do, you're going to get off track around the turns, and the sharper the turn, the more off track you're going to get. And it's nice to be able to put this in the simulator and actually see which way the aircraft is going to miss, so we can try and, like, maybe we want to pull that waypoint a little bit to the inside so when it blows out the turn, it doesn't go into the mountain or into the trees or something. But the main things we saw that were ways of getting the aircraft to be more accurate were the waypoint tracking accuracy, which controls how close the aircraft wants to be to the line in between the two waypoints, and the waypoint tracking angle, which controls how aggressively it will turn to get back onto that line versus gradually coming around and getting back onto the line. And the other parameter that we saw that affects this is the max nav bank angle. Where is it? Max nav bank angle, which is going to be a limiting factor. If that max nav bank angle is set to 30 degrees, so the aircraft can only turn that sharply, setting the tracking angle to some high number, it's not going to be able to do it, and that's going to limit it. So now we have some tools that help us force the aircraft to hit the waypoints that we're telling it to hit and stay on the track that we tell it to stay on, at least as best it can. But what we haven't talked about yet is altitude. is it actually hitting the altitudes that we're telling it to hit? If we told it to climb very quickly or descend very quickly, would it do that? Well, it turns out the answer is no, and we're going to talk about that in the next video in this series. There's a link in the video description below to a playlist with all of the videos in this series. I hope you will get a lot of information out of all of them, and if you do, I hope you will join my Patreon. It's less than the cost of a props. You spend more than my Patreon on props every single month, potentially every single week, depending on how often you fly. And you know what? If you don't feel like today's the day, it's okay. I don't just keep watching. I'm just glad to have you here. But I just want to remind you that it's there. And someday I hope that you'll go, damn it, I'm going to support Bardwell today. If today is the day, then link in the video description below. And I would love to have you as a supporter at whatever dollar amount you feel is correct for the amount of value you get out of my content. Here's the playlist card on screen and link in the video description below. And I will see you in the next one.